Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Constructed Criticism. This is episode 526. I'm your host, TZ, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, the man with the smile, Abe Stein,
That's me. I'm smiling today.
and the coach among the people, Mason Clark.
Hey, how y'all doing?
Today, though, we're not talking about smiles, we're not talking about coaching, we're talking about Pioneer before the RC. We're going to dive deep into it this week. We've got data, we've got a metagame, we've got power rankings, we've got all kinds of things to talk about. And all of that being said, there's a whole new set that comes out before the RC. So take all of it with a grain of salt. But let's dive in. So let's do the power rankings first. And I had a really interesting conversation with a patron about the way that we do power rankings today, for multiple hours. And I thought it was really interesting. So for those who don't know, the way that we do them is that you get points according to your placement. And it's loosely based upon similar records. So first place gets 6 points, second place gets 5 points, top 4 gets 4 points, top 8 gets 3 points, top 16 gets 2 points, and top 32, when we use it, gets 1 point. We didn't use any top 32s this week, just for clarity. But one of the things that's so interesting to me is, they really valued Swiss records, and they wondered why we gave so many more points for the finishing decks. And I just want to kind of comment on it before we dive in this week, that it's loosely based on records. So, one of the things I challenged them for was, hey, if a person that X2 wins the event, they will likely have a better record than a person that went X11 or X02 in that event by the end of it. And I think that's really interesting because, what we're really trying to do is, give you the points of the most match wins. With that being said, let's talk about how these rankings have shook out just in the last 3 days. So this is 3 challenges in the last 3 days, and we have Rakdos Aggro coming in first place with 26 points. Blue-White Control coming in second place with 22 points. Boros Mid-Range, the new kid on the block, with 14 points. Jund Sac coming in with 13 points. And Rakdos Transmog coming in with 9 points. And that is your top 5 decks in the last 3 days. Let's kind of discuss, guys. I think that this is interesting. We're going to have a Patreon bonus episode talking about what we would play and why. That will be available probably around the same time, if not earlier, than this episode. But I'm kind of curious, Abe, when you see these results, what do you think?
I mean, this is about what I've expected after looking at the format develop through the last 3 weeks or so. I mean, the Rakdos aggro deck, especially being at the top, is, I don't know, about as predictable as it gets. The deck has been just really, really strong since popping onto the scene as the best build of the Slickshot decks in terms of resiliency and explosiveness. I mean, the deck has multiple, turn 3 kills available to it and gets a lot of value out of not a lot of mana, especially in the form of damage, which is a hard thing to recover from in the format. So that kind of leading way for decks that are really trying to police that rather than engage in the kinds of games that, I mean, right, Phoenix not being on the list is kind of the biggest thing I think people should really, and might be surprised by, is that seeing Arclight Phoenix kind of die out as this deck has been able to have a good record against it. It being such a known quantity means that so many people are able to target it. And the format is really warped in a way that is really, really hostile to the Arclight Phoenix deck, and in part to this Rakdos deck, which is why looking at the next 4 decks, I'm pretty sure that all of them are decks that I would feel pretty good about playing against. against Rakdos, except for maybe like Jund Sacrifice, where it's pretty close. I don't know if you guys have a lot of experience with many of these decks or thoughts on like how we got here, but I definitely think that this is a really good snapshot of how things have evolved and developed in the last month or so.
Yeah, I think I've been playing a lot of Pioneer, getting ready for the RC. I'm finally playing one, not commentating it. And I played all these decks a lot. Honestly, Phoenix is the deck I've played the least just because I've played it so much historically. And the only thing that's surprising to me is the Rakdos Transmog. I mean, maybe Phoenix is like pretty close. I need to actually take a look at the total point spread, but I would have guessed that Phoenix would have came in a little higher than that. But I do think, like, you know, one of the things that happened with the banning of Vaneripper Amalia is the Slickshot decks got actually good. Well, before they were kind of like good decks, where they were like totally reasonable to win a tournament. It would not surprise me for anyone to win a tournament with a Slickshot deck, but like you are not as strong as the other things going on, and those decks have some things that like inherently line up really well against you, from incidental life gain to like big flying blockers in some cases to turn 3 wins. So like there's a lot of stuff that was happening in that regard, and the format really warped and shaped around those things. With those gone and getting the new Valiant Mice added as just other good things to enable this sort of all-in pump spell type game plan, combined with Callous Self-Sword effects, it's just not surprising to see Rakdos aggro shoot up. It is surprising how resilient the deck has been to everything, which I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about. But like seeing that, and then the second order of like the metagame is kind of once again narrowing in, and it's narrowing in on decks that blue-white can actually beat. Where Vaneripper did a lot of weird things to the blue-white matchup and made them play cards like Sunfall, like you had to because your rafts weren't good enough. They just actually dealt you damage still. And so now we're seeing like a completely shift in the metagame. And it's really interesting. And I think, you know, I think people who just thought they didn't need to practice for the RC until like today when the set hit Arena and Magic Online and they could just play their Phoenix, you know, are kind of in for a rude awakening. And it was looking that way a few weeks ago. And today it's sort of bearing fruit.
Yeah, when making these, you know, it was a little bit surprising. You know, we'll talk about Phoenix a lot, but I mean, let's just talk about it now. You know, we don't have a ton of data as far as like in the last 30 days for Pioneer, but one of the things that we do have is the most played deck is Phoenix with, you know, from what I'm seeing, 97 matches that are reported for mpgdex.net, which is what I use for stats. And it only has a 41% win percentage.
For the sake of like how much ever you care about Goldfish, for the last month, Rakdos aggro has been the most played deck representation wise, and over the last 14 days, the number is 22%.
Yeah,
and so just like Phoenix and Rakdos are like the two top for what it's worth. Like I do think Phoenix has played a ton, and the numbers bear that as well. So
yeah, and I played some Phoenix this week to like prep for the show, and I don't know. I honestly, the format feels a little hostile to it. Like it honestly feels like decks are really fast. There's not a lot that you can like. There's just not time to play like a bunch of cantrips and, you know, dirtle around.
I think another thing that really you can't talk about the current state of Pioneer without talking about is High Noon, which is a card that because of this, you know, because of Slickshot show off and because of Arclight Phoenix and also in part because of Treasure Cruise and Ledger Shredders, all these things that reward a high action economy format where you're casting just as many spells a turn as you really can afford to and converting them as fast as possible. That is not something that, like, without a card like this, which makes it so that people can only cast one spell a turn, like, that card has been instrumental in slowing down the Rakdos aggro deck. It's been slowing down the Phoenix deck. But when you look at it in just their parts, Phoenix is really reliant on casting multiple spells in the turn, whereas like Rakdos aggro deck can get by pretty easily with just casting a creature and then casting a pump spell once a turn, and maybe even like doing something in end step to like set up like, okay, I got Monstrous Rage on your turn and then untap an attack on my turn, use my Titan Strength. Like that's a that's an okay way to be, but not being able to cast multiple things in a turn because of the card High Noon, which is showing up in blue-white control. It's like the backbone of why this Boros mid-range deck that is really the newcomer here in this batch of decks in our power rankings. The way that deck is able to operate, and I think it's really the breakout card of the format and being able to be good against kind of, you know, it was four decks towards the top of Pioneer before the bans. It was Arclight Phoenix, it was the Slickshot show-off decks, it was Amalia, and it was Vampires. And with Amalia and Vampires catching bans, but those other two decks not, High Noon has been uniquely able to like target the play patterns of those two decks and enable the format to kind of breathe a little bit around that if you're able to play it in a way that maybe a card like Rest in Peace wouldn't do to attack the format.
What's so funny to me is it is another example of Lotus Field catching strays that happens all the time in this format. It like, for those Lotus Field gamers that like really love that deck, it feels like they're always catching stray hits. Like every time they're like, it's our turn. It's like, oh, maybe less than we thought.
Yeah, I mean, the Rakdos aggro deck popping up is the biggest stray hit they've ever seen, or it's just like, I don't interact, I kill you on turn 5 every game, come for it. And they're like, I kill you on turn 3. What are you talking about?
It was so funny. I was talking to Matt Kling about the kind of the format this week, and you know, I was like, you know, I just don't know that there will be a place for that slow of a combo deck to exist in this format for a while. Like, we're going to need something else to happen. And it is because, you know, synergy decks are really what has taken over this format.
That being said, I do think Lotus Field is like maybe the best positioned it's been in a while, which is not saying much, just because a lot of these other top decks besides aggro are tough for Lotus Field, and High Noon is a speed bump card for them. But it is a problem, but it is something that like you are prepared with. I will say like High Noon versus Phoenix, for example. I don't know how y'all feel about this, but if I had to choose like in game 1, I got to add one card to my hand. Would I rather have a Rest in Peace or a High Noon? I'd rather have High Noon. And a lot of that has to do with Phoenix decks being built to fight Graveyard Hate and not really having the ability to fight High Noon type stuff outside of something like Brazen Borrower to kind of like end of turn reset a High Noon, hopefully. This is why Blue White's so good as well, because it gets to play on both turns and can protect this sort of thing. But, you know, you stop them, then you hope to Treasure Cruise and deploy in a way that you can't with Rest in Peace. But it adds like another problem to like what Abe's saying. And High Noon has sort of become like this third pillar. And in my mind, really, it's the Wandering Emperor, like backing up High Noon of like, okay, this is like a card you can play 4 of. It will win the game and is good against basically every deck in the format and is like all you need to win. And if it wasn't for the mirror, you like would maybe even consider cutting to fairy type cards because of how like slow and clunky those things are and playing not synergistically with the rest of this game plan. And it's just a really different and weird format. So I'm hoping that if you're a listener, you have been preparing and not just resting on what you knew about Pioneer, because this is not the Pioneer from 6 months or a year ago. It is a like brand new, very weird format.
Yeah, let's talk about the format a little bit. Mason, I kind of want you to go first here, because I know when I've seen deck lists from you that you've been thinking about the future quite a bit. What are you thinking that people should be preparing for as far as the format goes, like as far as decks and strategies going into this RC?
Yeah, I mean, I say all this. I'm very interested to hear what y'all think about this. I think Rakdos Aggro and Phoenix are going to be the top 2 play decks, and I don't know if Phoenix should be, unless there's like some Phoenix thing I've like missed out on, like some innovations or whatever, or maybe it's like Phoenix and Spirit, but in practice it's like a different Izzety tempo-y deck. But I think those are going to be like the most played decks. I think Rakdos Aggro is the best deck in the format as of today. That might change. We just had Duskmourn hit like 5 hours ago. But as of right now, that is the deck I think you have to beat. I think Blue White Control and Jund Sac are this going to be the second best, or the second most represented type decks. And then Enigmatic Incarnation, I think, is going to be very highly represented. And I think blue-white control is like actively good. I think blue-white is probably like the deck that I look at and seems to be like, if you make it to the winner's metagame, it is the one that seems to like have the best chance of going the distance. Outside of the classic blue-white control has this issue of like winning and has like weird metagame issues that occur. But like if it was today, I would feel very comfortable, for example, if you told me I had to play blue-white control at the RC. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. It's like those 4 decks. I do think like putting Valgavoth into play via Transmog, more creativity, and just in general, I think the idea of putting a big thing into play and protecting it is pretty good. And however you want to do that, you know, that you can eat your Reese's whatever way you want. And they are all very profitable things.
All right,
so.
we got to have a real talk on this podcast. Did you say Reese's?
Yeah, it was a brand. It was a brand slogan they used to have, which was "You can eat this Reese's any way you want."
Yeah, I got that, but like it's Reese's, right?
It's Reese's Pieces.
No, I don't like that. Abe, I agree with most of what Mason is saying here. I think that there is going to be. It's funny. It reminds me of like Modern, not that long ago, where people will just play their deck, right? Like the deck that they're comfortable with. But I actually don't know if that's correct right now. Like I think that this format is really different. Are you pretty aligned with Mason here?
I mean, in general, I'd say I am. I think that the expected metagame there, I'm not certain how many people more than usual are going to play decks like blue-white. And I do think that Phoenix will probably be one of the most represented decks just because it is the deck that it is. But I think that the most important thing about the format right now, and I mean, especially just looking at the decks beyond these top, like 4 or 5 decks, is that there have been such massive changes to the play patterns of Pioneer and what matters that the people who are really going to succeed, no matter what archetype they pick, is really going to come down to how well they build their deck to function under these rules of engagement. I think that High Noon specifically is a card that, like, if you aren't building your deck with that card in mind when it comes to how you're approaching your fair matchups in game 1, or especially like your slower game plan decks in game 1, you are doing yourself a disservice. I think that the kind of incumbent combo deck has moved from being something like Lotus Field or Mono Green to being Jund Sacrifice. I think like the Yigra Cat combo stuff is really, really powerful. And I mean, having played that deck, if you have not played against that deck and are assuming it's like Rakdos Sacrifice was, you know, back in, I don't know, like a year ago, you're gravely mistaken. I mean, Scavenger's Talent alone enables the deck to play in a much more unfair pattern. It's almost Splinter Twin-esque of like you are playing a sack game that is on the board fair and setting up to be able to suddenly turn the game around and just immediately combo off to the point where like so much about so many decks have to change in order to compete in this landscape. And I think that, I mean, even talking about decks like Phoenix, which currently are being counted out somewhat and are not seeing results according to the power rankings, like they have options and opportunities to change. You know, they can build their decks in ways to try to power through a High Noon or change their threats or, you know, play more answers to it or find different sideboard plans that work well against it. These are all options they have. But I think that until the format really has had a chance to settle around how are decks dealing with the presence of this card that warps the way the games look so much, you know, those decks have had a real natural advantage. I think that it's really cool to have an RC this close to this much change because I think a lot's going to get shaken out.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, you know, it's only 3 challenges that I did these power rankings for. Birds and Mono Green both did get at least a top 8 within these challenges pretty early. Actually, I think literally yesterday they both top 8'd a challenge. So it's not like the decks are dead, but I think that one of the things that's really interesting to me is that in a world where Rakdos midrange was king, not even like, I mean, it has to be like a year ago, right? Like, maybe Monogreen was kind of at the top right then, but I don't know. Like, the format has changed so much. One of the things that interests me, and like this is what I'll say about the RC, is that if you add creativity and transmogrified X together as different strategies, they would have actually come in pretty high. They actually would have come in like third place if you just put all of them together and not just the Rakdos ones. And I like what Mason you said about like this is a deck that kind of avoids the High Noon problem, where it's like, no, I don't even need to worry about the card. Like that's just not how I'm going to play my game plan. And I think that decks that get to do that, like Blue White Control, while it gets to play it, like are pretty strong right now. And if you can force your opponent, I like I don't know which one of you said about like speed bumps. Like if you can create speed bumps that are meaningful in this format, it's blazing fast, because like even the Jund Sac decks, like they can start comboing off like way faster than you expect. Like they assemble their stuff, and then all of a sudden this huge snowball happens, and like the game isn't over, but like it's over. Like you're not coming back from what just happened. And I don't know. I think that like some of these decks kind of rule here. Are there new cards? You guys talked about Enigmatic Incarnation. It got 0 points in the power rankings. Oh, actually, no. I think we got.
Yeah, but that's I think today, like we even had a conversation with Spencer, like on the air, was like, should we even be doing today? And I think this is the one deck where it's like the Duskmourn stuff does matter for her, because one, I think there's a lot of things you should just change about your Enigmatic deck, and two, the deck got so many tools from Duskmourn, and obvious and unobvious ones, where it's like, okay, these cards, like for example, the Overlords, we mentioned in the set review a lot. Those cards slot in there, and then there's some of the weirder cards that like maybe this is good in the deck, maybe it's not. We kind of have to test it, and that deck just needed the power upgrade. So I don't know how Abe feels about it, but to me, that's like a deck where it's like you needed to have friends that you were testing with before to really kind of have a feel on things, and if not, then today being Tuesday is your first time to really get in with like what matters with it.
Yeah, I mean, full disclosure to listeners, like I have quite a few Enigmatic lists that I'm working on for the RC, probably 2 or 3 different approaches and iterations, and I'm currently in the hole of like, okay, well, I can't rent the cards currently, so I am kind of relegated for one more day until I can to actually start playing, and I think a lot of people are in that spot. But also means that it's really an unknown quantity heading into this week. Mm-hmm. I mean, by the end of this week, and as the RC comes upon us next week, I think that it'll be pretty clear at least how good the archetype is, whether or not that means people are going to adjust the way they're building their decks, or what plans in those decks are really good. But I think also there's going to be some amount of people not wanting to pull the trigger on that because of the short amount of time they have, or wanting to keep certain things under wraps, and seeing a lot of different builds of the deck kind of converge at that tournament. To Mason's point of saying it could just be very well be the 5th most played deck, or even the top 4, depending on how many people really choose to stick with it.
Yeah, one thing to say too here is, like, I guess I'll say I am also got some decks for it, and Abe and I have talked a little bit, but we also have some different testing people. So some people are sworn to secrecy. I understand. It's all good. And I will say that I, luckily thanks to Daybreak, I have a God account. So I've played 3 matches. I'm 3-0 so far with the deck. And just like first impressions are like red and green Overlord. Like my gut, the first 3 games really show kind of what I thought, which is like the green one's going to be a little slow against the aggro decks. It's going to be hard to find time to tap out for it outside of it being like a big body. And the red one's going to be great in those spots, and sort of vice versa in other matchups where it's like if the game's going along, I'm going to love the green and maybe like the red a little less. And, only 3 matches in, but it kind of played out that way, and it's felt very strong. And I think the deck needs to be completely rebuilt, which is a thing when talking to like other Enchanted players. Basically, everyone was like, as the set was being previewed, it's like, well, you have to rebuild the whole set, and this set is like an enchantment set, so waiting until you got all the commons and uncommons is super important, just to have like the random removal spell or the random thing that might be like the missing piece to this deck. So
yeah, I love that. I love that. We don't have to talk about like 100 cards here, but are there new cards that people should be thinking about going into their RC testing other than we mentioned Pyroclasm already, but like anything else?
There are a couple of there's Light Mage's Blessing, the single white hexproof enchantment that I think could bring people to want to play decks like Bogles again. That deck has results, and there's also the 1 and a white like enchanted creature Fiend Hunter is another creature which lends itself to that archetype as well. That might be something people are drawn to. I think like the enigmatic cards and the overlords definitely draw people in, and I think that Valgavoth definitely draws people into those strategies as well. So keeping that in mind towards what the possibilities are and what kinds of strategies might start seeing an uptick when you're thinking about what are the things I want to make sure I've covered when building your deck or building your sideboard and having your plans, just giving those things an extra thought of how is this different than it was before. But I don't know if you guys have any feelings on much else, but those are really like the big outliers outside of the cards that go in Enigmatic.
I don't just mean in Enigmatic though. I wonder like holistically, like are there things that people should be considering? I think about. I guess you kind of covered some of that. I look at the green Overlord as like possibly like a stable that we didn't expect. I got to play with that card quite a bit today, and it actually plays a little bit better than I expected. With like, I guess I was like maybe tempering my expectations, but I was really impressed with that card. It actually does not take that long to come off of its quote unquote suspend. I don't know, Mason, what about you?
I'm going to be a little blunt. I've said it a couple times. I think if you're starting your testing now for the RC, you just got to pick a stock deck. Like, you can't be doing crazy stuff and like doing like exploring off the wall stuff, because the time you're all hearing this podcast, it's 1 week and a day until the RC for the United States. Now, if you're around the world, there's lots of things to explore, like we just talked about. Canadians, Europeans, all of y'all, there's like a lot of good things. I know we have listeners there, but for my US homies, I think like picking up a deck like Rakdos Valiant is probably your best bet of succeeding. Even though people are going to attack it, it is very good, and it is like really reminds me kind of Infect-esque with being more resilient of Old Modern, where it's just like this deck is solid, it kills really quickly. If your opponent has the right cards for you, it can be tough but not impossible. And even if they do have the right cards, sometimes you're on the play, they have a tap land, and you just run them over. And I have built decks that are like top down, stomp on you, being the Rakdos deck, and have just lost still because, they have such powerful draws. So, there are a lot of cool cards. There's a lot of things to explore, but I think you really need to kind of hone in on like the kind of known things. And I think stuff like Overlord and like Enigmatic makes sense to be exploring, and that's like, a slotting card. But I think, to your point, Spencer, Overlord might open up whole different things in Pioneer, but I think that's going to take a lot of time to figure out, or a lot of iteration and a lot of work. So if it's just you and your couple friends, I'm not trying to be a downer. I'm just trying to give you realistic advice from where I'm sitting, not knowing what you know and what you're able to put in time for. So
no, I think that's totally fair, and I really like this type of event. Like personally, like one of my favorite things that I've done in Magic is testing for Pro Tours, like testing for a format that is 2 weeks old, right? And that's what's happening here. Like that's what you get. This is like the first real RC where I feel like having a group of people that you're testing with really benefited you compared to like other RCs, as far as like sharing information, breaking things down, things like that. This one like is, I think it'll hit different. I think this one will feel like those old school Pro Tours in a lot of ways. I'm very jealous of those going as I don't get ahead to DC.
Yeah, it's super weird too, like compared to like the RC I qualified for the Pro Tour with in Atlanta, the RC1, where it's like that was actually release day of Brothers War, which is like so much different because it really limits you. Where this, you do sort of, like you're saying, have a much more Pro Tour experience where it's like there's a little bit of data and you might be able to like extrapolate and get something really good that like you couldn't do on the first day, like the actual first days of like a set being street legal. And that, has like huge implications. So even if you had played that one, I think it's different because people will have like, if you start today and you buy from, GoatBots or whatever, your overlords or some weird card you have faith in, you might be able to go the distance and actually figure something crazy out. It's just, you've got to have that time and that stuff. And it's exciting. I'm really happy to be playing this event.
Any final thoughts from anybody on kind of the state of Pioneer? I already mentioned that we're going to do what we would play Patreon episode that's available for patrons of $5 or more for the bonus episode. But yeah, anything from you guys?
I will say that, if you look at I think will be in the show notes, Red Spencer, the breakdown on the power rankings deeper than the top 5.
Yeah, so I'll put in the top X decks, but like the entire thing is only available to patrons. But yes, more than the top 5 will be in the show notes.
Yeah, and just looking at the numbers on it for this episode, these top 5 decks are the top 5, but like right around the mark of Rakdos Transmogrify, there are a couple other decks at 8 points. There are decks coming in at 5 or 6 points, and there's a large variety of them too. Like there are a lot of archetypes that are kind of playing into the pillars that we see on display here, saying that like, in the last 3 days, kind of, controlling high noon decks and, red-black Slickshot decks and Sacrifice are all, very, very much at the top. But I mean, if you were to really look deeper into those results and start combining based on, even just Slickshot as an archetype or, High Noon as an archetype, rather than choosing it based on like the actual specific deck, I don't know. I think it just starts to really coalesce into a pretty deep picture of the metagame that shows there's a lot of opportunity to play different styles of decks and different builds of those different styles of decks too. Which means that I think it's going to be a really good RC, and I think that a lot of people's, I mean, mine included, complaints about Pioneer and the state of it prior to the bans. I'm like pretty optimistic about this being a really cool tournament to play, and I think the format being in a pretty cool and fun place, at least for the remainder of the RCs to come from Duskmourn onwards, as there's just a lot of room for things to evolve and change over the rest of the RC season for everywhere outside of the US too. So
yeah, I really love what you said about like the decks that came close, because the deck that we didn't talk about that I hate, but I do feel like we have to mention, is Angels, as a deck that is actually kind of good against the Slickshot decks, and is something that I already know like multiple people locked into for this RC, and I don't know, like, would I do it? No, but it's a thing.
I can't imagine him being locked in at all yet.
Yeah,
let alone on Angels.
Hey man, I'm just saying, I'm just spreading the truths.
Sure, yeah, that sounds great for my win rate.
The only cards I've secured from the new set for this RC, hand to God, are just the lands. So if that shows you how locked in I am, it's that I've got just the new lands. Like, there's a lot of things to still explore, and I think it's going to be a really good tournament for that reason.
Yeah. All right, that is going to do it for our Pioneer Deep Dive, preparing for the RC. Don't forget to check out our sponsors, Untapped.gg, just click the link in the show notes. That's it. Just do that. Just do it, people. It's in the show notes. You're playing Arena. You're getting your quests done. You might as well do it in style with Untapped GG, the best deck overlay in the whole game. Don't forget to share the Swag Store. Anything that you do gives us a little bit of a kickback. But let's talk about always improving. It is the point of the show. Every week on the show, we like to talk about things that we're doing to try and get better. And, whether it's magic or life or whatever, this mentality of just being better today than you were yesterday and giving it your all is what constructive criticism is all about. So I'm going to go first this week. And I'm kind of excited. I played a lot of Magic because I've been sick and just couldn't actually stay in bed that long. You only after 12 hours of being in bed, it's just I can't actually be in bed more than this. And because of that, I got to play a lot of Magic. And one of the things that happened is I went through one of the worst losing streaks I've ever had in Magic. Part of it could be being sick, part of it could be, whatever. But then immediately, had a quick 5-0 in a league and, just took every opportunity to learn. Didn't let things upset me when things were going wrong. And I think that so often for Magic players, you will take the out, right? Oh, I'm getting unlucky. Oh, I'm not feeling my best, or you'll find in Smash they're called Johns, the excuses of why you didn't succeed when you could have, or why you didn't play your best. And I just never let that happen. I accepted the variants that were happening. I realized, my deck was built wrong here. So regardless of whether or not I got unlucky, Fable Passage was in my deck here and it should have been something else. And it was a really good feeling to just kind of push through that bad thing. And I think that happens in life a lot. And is something that when I think about my day to day, the bad things are going to happen. It's just part of life. And it's about what we do to get through those bad things and push forward. And that, a game like Magic that has those ups and downs is a really good lesson, a really good teacher of that lesson, I should say.
Yeah, I think this is something you hear from Magic players a lot, which is the idea that Magic helps them in their life when it comes to bad beats, essentially, right? Where it's their tires pop on their car or whatever, and it's yeah, it sucks. I'm not happy, but it's I don't know. It was going to happen at some point. Something was going to go wrong with my car. I'm going to have to, do something, and maybe that happens on the same day, something else, other bad thing happened. And it's just yeah, these things happen. And I think it's also, it leads to, I think, Magic players appreciating stuff a lot more too. It's the second order. Once you really internalize that, then you're oh wow, these good things in my life are good. And you realize how lucky you are for things like having a family or a job or friends or the ability to play Magic. And I think it's really good. And I'm glad that, you were helpful with that. It was helpful for that.
Yeah. Mason, what about you?
Yeah, so my always improving moment this week comes from this past weekend. I went up to Old Caldwell, Ohio to play the Apex Gaming team event with my two friends, Elliot Raff and Corey Baumeister. And my always improving moment comes from the actual team event. So we ended up ultimately top 4ing, but that's kind of as far as we got. And in one of the top 8 matches, Corey and I were discussing a mulligan he had. And the too long didn't read, and you can watch this all on his YouTube in the backpack stream. You can even hear us talk about it. But basically, he showed me this 5-card hand. And, the 5-card hand was an Urza Saga as the only land. And no baubles. It was just a Tameo and a bunch of 2-mana cards. And he goes like, I want to keep, and it's clearly doing the thing you do in a team tournament where you get your teammates' approval so that you do not, get like ragged on whatever. Not that I've ever really ragged on him. Seriously, I might do it for the camera because it'd be funny and it's good content for him. But like seriously, I just wouldn't really care. I like trust Corey's decisions. He's a very smart and good Magic player. And I go, and this is one of the interesting things is like I played a lot of team tournaments with Jessie back when she played Breach a bunch, and I just watched her win on Multiple fours all the time. And so I tell Corey this. I was like, you can keep that if you want, but I would mulligan to 4. I watched Jessie just do that a lot. And we go back and forth for a couple minutes, and he kind of hits me with like, I never go below 5 with this deck, And I think it was a really interesting moment because Corey is someone who's really, really good at Magic, right? Like has so many GP top 8s, clearly, understands the game really well, succeeds a lot in Magic tournaments. This past weekend he finals the solo 5K at Apex, and then we got 4th in this one, or top 4, excuse me. And so it's very, very good, knows this Breach deck better than I do, and has this interesting thing that is something that to me is sort of this immediate, like, that's a nonsense statement, right? Like if someone in coaching told me that I never go below 5 with Breach, I would tell them, only the Sith steal an absolute as like a joke, and then talk about how like we need to consider what we're doing, right? And like a vibes-based thing, isn't it? Now, in reality, what happens is Corey mulligans to 4, Hand of God draws the exact same hand with 1 card different. It still only has the Urza Saga. He keeps on 4, has no permanence at the end of turn 3, wins the game like 10 turns later.
I love that.
But the thing is, the interesting part of my always improving moment, I need to give all that to say this. There are some things that are like this where it's like, I would never do this, right? Like Corey, like the statement, I just don't go below 5 is like a thing I never think about. And Corey is a like stronger Magic player than me and more accomplished. So like maybe there's something I need to be checking in this regard. And that is my always improving moment, which is kind of like step 1 in a place where I haven't fully digested it yet. I don't know what I'm taking away from this long term, but I know that it was a really interesting challenge point. And it's not even a thing where he was like tilted in the moment or joking around. Like we talked about it later. Like, he ends up winning that match overall and that game. And we talked about it at dinner, and I was like, he bought us a round of drinks or whatever for like, as a thank you for helping like with the backpack stream and everything all weekend. And I was like, hey, and this one's also that Molda 4. And he was like, the Molda 4 is bad. I shouldn't have done it. And we like led to like a serious conversation about it. And I know, I just think it's something interesting about like this idea. And so I don't know. It's a weird, always improving moment. I think it's going to lead somewhere. I just don't know what that is yet.
I think taking opportunities, like recognizing opportunities to become learning moments is really important. And we actually have a training grounds set up for this in the future. So that's really interesting. I have 2 questions for you, though, Mason.
I have 2 answers.
Good. So the first one is, I will donate $20 to the charity of your choice if you can tell me what Star Wars movie you just quoted.
The Sith's only deal in absolute, I believe, is the 3rd movie where Obi-Wan Kenobi is talking to Anakin. So,
congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you.
We'll deal with this $20 donation off of the air.
Can I say the Abe Stein Foundation is accepting donations?
Yeah, the Abe Stein Foundation. Money for Abe's.
Abe's everywhere.
Yeah.
Clamoring for the Abe.
This Abe wants an Overlord of the Hauntwoods, though. He'll accept that as well.
My second question is do you think that like Magic players as a whole still don't mulligan enough with the London Mulligan?
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
Pay my rent teaching people to mulligan. So until that stops or becomes a less part of coaching, I'm going to have to say yes on that one, Capitan.
There's a button right next to keep, and it says "Pay my rent." I mean, mulligan.
I don't remember the exact quote, but there was a moment where we had a conversation about mulliganing when it was I think it was me and Michael, and you were the producer on that episode, Mason, where I don't even remember what he said, but it was something along the lines of like, why would you keep an unplayable hand that could never win a game of Magic when you get a new hand regardless of how many cards it is. And I just, that was, I don't, was that even with the Vancouver Mulligan? Like, I don't even remember.
No, Hinterrocker was working at Wizards by the time that stuff happened.
Well, no, he was on the podcast with me when I did the Vancouver Mulligan, when I went to Vancouver.
Oh, sorry, I'm confusing Vancouver and London as the names.
Yes.
Sorry.
Well,
yeah, sorry.
I don't even know if the Vancouver Mulligan had happened yet when we did that episode, but like
Vancouver Scry.
Yeah,
it had happened.
Okay,
because I didn't play competitive Magic until the Scry rule was invented. Okay. So,
it's wild. I've won more games on a Mold of 4 than I care to admit. Like, I don't know if I mulligan too much, but like, I really loved that. And that, keep us updated. Like, what do you learn from that conversation? It's like, there are some decks like Gruul Slickshot where like, I probably would not go to 4 with that deck. I think that it is a it's a resource heavy deck that can't win like that. I mean, unless like there's literally no lands, I'd probably. Hey, what about you? What's your always improving moment?
Yeah, I mean, before I get my always improving moment, I just want to say that like I really love that always improving moment, Mason, because I think that oftentimes, and I know there are some people in the Discord who get this feeling sometimes of like disagreeing with players who are better than you is like something you shouldn't do. But disagreeing with players who are really good at Magic and expressing that and having that conversation is how both you and that player get the opportunity to get better and learn more. And like, I'm sure in having that conversation about that hand with Corey, you got a lot of great opportunity and insight to understand how he thinks about the deck. And you also got to challenge his beliefs in a way backed up by the data of watching another very, very strong player of that archetype make similar decisions, right? Like that's really how people's understanding grows. And like, I mean, I remember I don't talk about it that much because I do feel somewhat embarrassed about it to say that like for such a long time I was adamantly like mana dorks are bad and like playing them is foundationally a mistake. Because they just die to removal spells and your lands don't. And you can just take a little bit more time and hit your land drops. That says a lot about kind of player I am. But, like really having that conversation out with you and Bob one time working on a deck for like an SCG, like made me put into words how I felt about it. And then also hear the other side in a way that helped me grow as a player and understand like there is validity to what I'm saying about why they're not as like so good that you should always be drawn to them and where they can be weak, but also that like there are situations they create that other cards can't. And so
and you qualified for the Pro Tour playing a deck with 8 of them, right?
Yeah. Once I understood how great they were, it all made sense.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is a great one. I also want to give a quick shout out to Corey because like he also, I mean, for the story, he trusted me and like was willing to like listen to his teammates when basically like I don't have any proof, in the moment. So I might as well like trust this person that I decided to team with. And I think that's like another very big thing from like, if you're in a team event, listen, somebody on the team's always the best, right? And in our team event, it was me, but it could have been Corey. And I know I'm just joking. And I just think like, if you feel like maybe you are like, someone, there's always just someone who's the best. That's just how things work, right? At every point, someone is better than someone else. That doesn't mean you shouldn't listen. And Corey did like take that trusting moment and was like, listen, I don't think I should mulligan to 4, but also I don't think this hand's very good. And my teammate is trusting me, like, and trusts this deck and thinks I can do it. Also worth noting, he's playing against Jeskai control, so he does have a lot of time. Like, he can miss his first land and go pretty far. So, like, just kudos to him, too, for doing that. And I think, like, in a weird way, kind of leading by example for others who, like, maybe don't even, like, realize that when they're watching the Backpack stream and hearing us talk about this mulligan.
Anyway, my always improved moment for this week. And I realized I have not had an always improved moment in like 3 shows because I was out and then it was the pick 2. But I have been like in the streets playing a ton of Pioneer, really able to go like put in legwork on the format out of the RC, which has been really awesome and exciting. And I think probably the biggest always improved moment for me out of this entire process has been in working on the Enigmatic deck, because I don't think I've really done anything much differently than I had in the past in terms of, doing my research every week or so, or even less on just reading all the deck lists that are coming out and deck list dumps, theorizing sideboard plans, trying to understand what I think is good, or looking at the things that are new that are winning, and kind of trying to figure out what the pieces are there that are making that tick. What this has come from is working on specifically the Enigmatic deck and the mana base. Something that I know has come up on the show before is the whole, okay, yeah, these spells, 24 lands, napkin deck list, okay, go ship it. And that works some of the time. But in the case of something with so many color requirements and basic land requirements as, a deck with Chain to the Rocks and 5 colors of spells, and Leyline Binding, and you need to make sure you have enough tap lands and untapped lands or not so many tap lands that you're playing a turn behind, but enough untapped lands that maybe you're not taking too much damage, and you need these land types. It was actually just a lot to get my hands around. And rather than, kind of fudging it and saying, oh, well, I'll copy a mana base, or, maybe I'll do things on crutches where, I'll play a build with more Nihilist presences or more Path of the World trees, even though I might not think that's where it would be best. I buckled down and put in the time and work and use some of the resources available out there to just do the math and look into what my mana base requirements were and what I was trying to accomplish, and figure out what that needed to look like. I mean, I think I've redone the Enigmatic mana base for different builds of it 3 times in the last week. And each time just getting out the Frank Carson article on, how many sources you need, and just trying to figure that out, and doing similar math on, how many mountains do I need, or how many of this do I need to be able to cast this on turn that. And really just doing the hard work of deck building that is building mana bases for a deck like that. And I don't know, it's something I hadn't really done in the past, but I knew how to do from just having read those articles and seen other people do it. And especially, I want to give a huge shout out to Jason Yee for having a mana base calculator and checker on its website. If you go to its blog and click in the top, there's a link to a deck a mana base checker where you can put in how many sources you have of what kind of spells you're trying to cast, what's the mana requirement you need to hit on a turn, along with how many sources of if you have white red duels and blue red duels, putting in we have 8 white red duels and 8 blue red duels, how many what are my odds of being able to cast a Crackling Drake, something that's blue red red, and it just does the math for you. So it was a really, really strong resource that I knew about because of working with Sanctum Ball for the PT, but leveraging that and leveraging, my intuition on what I needed for my deck, and kind of working that all together to make a mana base that I think has been really good. And I felt really strong about the mana bases I've built for each of the iterations of the deck that I've put together, and knowing that moving forward, as I'm still continuing to iterate and change things, I now have this intimate knowledge of what is the right triome, or the right shockland mix, or the right verges to play in my deck in order to cast the spells on time, and how many sources roughly do I need, and how can I make that all happen. Really putting in the work on that has been probably the biggest new thing I've been doing for myself in preparing for this RC.
I have 3 things to say. 1, thank you for the shout out for the calculator. And I guess that's really 2 things to say. We also did a podcast about that Frank Karsten article that Abe mentioned about mana bases. They are episode 144 and episode 172. Those are the 2 constructive criticism episodes on mana bases. Every week on the show, we want to give a shout out to our newest patron. This week, we want to give a shout out to our patrons. This week, we want to give a shout out to Chris. Chris joined the Patreon, I think today, actually. So shout out. If you want to be a patron like Chris, come over to patreon.com/ccmg. You can ask a question like Paul, who says, when you're trying to get an invite via RCQ, how much time each week are you putting in for each RCQ? Is the preparation you're doing only games via MTGO, or is there playtesting with your group? What is your process? Abe, go first.
My hours a week put into preparing for an RCQ, it depends on a couple of things. Like for right now, like let's say, I mean, looking at modern season, right? If I knew I was playing a modern RCQ, which I don't plan on doing for another couple weeks, I'd probably put about 4 or 5 leagues in across 2 or 3 decks I'm considering, and then think about how the format looks and how I felt about them, and then spend the rest of the time outside of those, 20 to 25 matches over that week, which would, I guess, be like an hour and a half or 2 hours a league, depending on the deck. So 8-10 hours. Yeah, I'd spend the rest of the time just thinking about, once I've settled on a deck, what do my sideboard plans look like with the list I've chosen? And, am I comfortable with that? And then once I have a deck I'm really settled on and I feel comfortable with, I don't really put much more time into playing unless there's something I feel like I need to learn in order to succeed, or if there's something I want to make sure I understand better, or I'm thinking about audibling. But I mean, in the past, during seasons where I was not nearly as familiar with a lot of things as I am now, I'd say I was probably playing about as much, but also doing a lot more work on the research side, and also playing specific matchups that I felt were important with my play group. If I felt like I didn't have it down necessarily, and just leveraging the players around me who I felt could be like good or even better pilots than some of the ones who I'd play against in the RCQs and matchups I was trying to figure out how to navigate, and doing that. But I think that, like, really it's about finding whatever process and time allotment works for you to feel comfortable in having your game plan, and having that game plan be a good and effective one for the matchups you expect, and knowing how to navigate those most common ones. So not ever feeling blindsided is really my goal. So I find that I get a lot of that done by doing a lot of research and a lot of just like playing games in my head, or like theory crafting ideas, and either watching content creators play, or watching like just streamers play the format in general to kind of understand play patterns, and working with it from there. But it really is whatever gets you to that comfort level that I think is what works best. How about you, Mason? What's your process?
I feel pretty strongly that like Magic practice in general should be working on like fundamental skills like attacking and blocking, deck building, sideboards, macro and micro game planning. And then your preparation for an event should be you kind of doing what you talked about, Abe, of like catching up with speed, or maybe playing a little bit of your deck, or trying to, like figure out like the stuff that's beyond the core thing. I think a lot of times people like, how does this, when they're like trying to get the RC invite, they kind of like, okay, it's time to kind of do everything. I think you should sort of be endurance training always. And then when you're preparing for these RCQs, it should be only a couple hours of work. And that's because you put in all this other work all the time, sort of staying ready. And so, you maybe play a league with your deck, you read an article if you can find one, you maybe watch someone talk about your deck a little bit. And I think a lot about kind of how I want the games to play, which we talk a lot about on the podcast, but just, okay, like, can I afford to have this card line up poorly against, Heartfire Hero? Like, is that going to be a problem? How do I line up against Slickshot? How do I line up against Treasure Cruise? Like, all those sort of things. And same thing for the RC. I'm using Pioneer as the example today, but like, that's really how I go through it. And it should just be like a couple hours spread across the week thinking about stuff and sort of, getting yourself ready. And if you're not there and you're still working on some of those things or catching up, that's fine. But I do think just really thinking about how the games play is the thing that matters the most for RCQ, and that's how I'm preparing. So what about you, Spencer?
I made a tweet about this like literally yesterday. I found this Patreon question so funny. I'm going to give you the answer, but I also want to say this. I don't think that replicating other people's processes is the answer in Magic. I think that from I've done interviews with probably every single major team in the last 20 years of Magic. and from the Pro Tour, from the SCGs, and I don't think that's what you should do. I think, as Abe said, you need to find a process that works for you. So I want to preface my answer with that. Like, there is a level of like, I don't play that much Magic and I still win, and like there was a time I remember when PV was quoted for like literally, and John Finkel, the two best Magic players of all time, were both quoted saying they never play Magic outside of Pro Tour testing for like 8+ years. Just literally never once did they do it. And that is not the process you should follow for like most people. And I would encourage you that while you're asking this question and you're trying to gain information about like other people's processes, to write it down and build your own, because what works for you works for you. And it also, for what it's worth, as I'm saying this, will help you when you're picking who you want to test with, because they will have similar processes to you in a lot of ways. So for me, for RCQ testing, it's interesting. Like, I think for RCQs, I'm really, really close to Abe as far as like, I don't know, it could be like 5-10 hours of playing a week, really looking at deck lists, understanding like what I think the format is about, what I think people are going to show up with. Do I need cyber cards for specific things? And kind of going from there. I think that it's about what works for you, though. Like, there were times where I played 40+ hours of Magic a week, and as Mason would say, like, a lot of that effort was wasted. Like, I didn't really need to do that much of that Magic. But if you are the type that needs to literally have played interactions to see interactions, then you need to know that about yourself.
Yeah, and I think also just like as one last thing, I was thinking of in listening to you and Mason is like, I couldn't agree more with what you just said of finding what works for you, and you shouldn't necessarily just be following someone else's process. There is no one way to be successful in Magic, but trying other people's processes and taking inspiration from what seems like it works for them and taking that to you, like, that is how you learn how your process should be, right? Like, you'll find things that work for you, find things that don't work for you, and then synthesize that and move forward. And especially when it comes to leveling up and getting that result you're really looking for, like, you have to be hungry to do it. And so definitely just try things and see what works. And if you feel like something is or is not working, or it feels like it was a good use of time, not a good use of time, like, don't be afraid to tell yourself that. Don't think that it's just going to be like, I did something wrong because I played 2 leagues a night for like a month ahead of my RCQ, and then I didn't really feel prepared. It's like, that means that was not the right process for you. Doesn't mean you did something wrong.
It's so funny too, because like, I remember Mason had been streaming and like was just playing like off the wall decks, and then went and won an RCQ with like just like a stock version of something. I don't even remember what it was. And then like a listener reached out to me and was like, hey, like, I've been watching Mason stream, and like, he didn't play this deck at all on stream. I was like, yeah, Mason was like, just having fun. And they were like, well, like, how did he know how to play this deck? I was like, well, that's not how Mason practiced. Like, he's practicing principles. He's not practicing interactions. Like, what are you trying to practice? Like, they're different things. So
I played so much blue-black Lutri before Dallas, and when I played mono green,
it's true. I remember.
I beat so many mono green players with blue-black Lutri. I was like, this is the answer. And then I played against a single Fable the Mirror Breaker. I was like, green it is. It's
yeah.
to learn.
I mean, when I played 4-color all the time with Yorion, I never played Yorion. I can tell you every Yorion game I played in the league because I can remember them all. It was so few.
It was like 2 leagues.
It was 3 leagues.
Yeah.
Like, my partner at the time wanted to play a league because they were picking up the deck, so I played with her, and I played a league because Abe and Ginger told me I should play one before I go to the Vegas or whatever, and I had never played the deck before, and then I played another one on stream and hated it. And, like, that's it. And I won more than you should in Magic during that time, and I just played all the other decks. It's not like I played the Loris decks. I played, like, random stuff because I wanted to understand how those decks operate. And it is also, some amount of playing for fun as well. But, like, a lot of it is, like, I just, if I can't visualize how to play it, then I'll play it to try and get a better idea.
Yeah. I really love this question, Paul. So I just want to say thank you because we try to give structure on this show, right, Dave? Like, where we're really trying to give you, like, tools. But, like, that's all it is, right? We're not giving you the answer. Like, if somebody could give you the answer, it'd make a lot more money than this podcast makes. No, we're trying to give you tools. And I think this question is one that a lot of Magic players have. You can join the conversation joining the Patreon Discord, just like Paul, just like our newest patron over at FCMTG on Patreon. You can also join the public Discord, where we talk fantasy football, and I get to have vile, terrible interactions with our other patron, Adrian Carr, as I beat him down on fantasy football this week. So, as well as other stuff. What are we going to say?
Just that if you're going to talk about vilely beating down one of the patrons of fantasy football, we need no Johns, no commentary, final score next week.
Oh, it was 110 to 89.
110 to 89 in your favor?
Yeah.
All right.
He said he was going to hand out L's to me and my wife in this league. And we gotta keep Adrian in his place.
He brought your wife into it?
Dude, he did.
That's in your house.
You can leave a YouTube comment. Those are always helpful. Abe asked for a big one last week, Mason. He's like, get us more likes on next week's episode. Not only did that not happen, but the other episode got even more likes.
I'll take that. You know what? Get that one in the algo. Spin it up. Run it up. Run it up.
Run it up. You can also follow us on Twitter at CCMTG. You can check out our other show with Sam Black on the Constructor Zone Network. That is, of course, Drafting Archetypes. And then subscribe, review, comment wherever you are. It helps a ton. Mason, where can people find you?
Find me on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. Find me at twitch.tv/the Mason Clark. And you can reach out for me at coaching Mason Clark at gmail.com or that same Twitter there. And we can set some stuff up for after the RC. Abe, how about you?
You can find me at twitter.com/morenothings. You can DM me for coaching, but again, I'm not going to be available until after the RC myself as well. Spencer, what about you?
Find me at He's a Game on Twitter. You can find me at Spencer13Heezy, I think it is, on TikTok, as well as every week on the Neat Nerd podcast. A podcast about nerding out, whether it's movies, TV, anime, video games, whatever it is. Also, just because of kind of the state of things for me, I am also again going to open up coaching. Limited spots. Just email me at spencerhowland@gmail.com. Happy to help out people. Probably after the RC, I don't really feel like I'm ready to take on that, this week, but yeah, hit me up. And that's going to do it for this week's episode of CCMTG. Thank you all so much for listening. See you all next week for a brand new episode.